everybody, my name is Laura Grismore. I'm with Studio 176 and here today with Jay Ross and Kay Rossbach. They are our first dynamic duo in our In-Tandem series that we have this summer, which will be June, July, August, featuring 2 artists each month that have a strong creative connection to each other, live together, work together, create together. So these 2 are from Minneapolis and they've come all the way up here. Their work will be up through June 26th and their reception is tomorrow evening, 4 to 7 p.m. So thanks.
Hey, I'm Kay Rossbach. I am a graphic designer, artist, and illustrator from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Hey, I'm Jay Ross. I'm an artist from Minneapolis. Professionally, I'm a graphic designer, and as an artist, I'm an illustrator, printmaker, and writer.
So thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for letting us interview you. Our first question here is just tell me a little bit more about your connection to one another in terms of art.
So we're married.
Marriage.
So that's our relationship.
Yeah.
I would say we're like creative partners in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I think that was even in our wedding vows that we would like basically
make stories together.
Yeah. And that kind of influences and informs just like a lot of our relationship.
Yeah, I would say that we spend a lot of time just like talking about sort of creative ideas, or just we'll say like little bits of like, hey, these characters that we have, what if they did this? We both have a love of storytelling and with illustrations, we'll both kind of do a story with the illustration rather than something that looks cool, and that's what we tend to focus on. So I think with our relationship, it's also about these stories where we'll just kind of, tell them to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and current work?
Yeah, so right now I'm doing a long-form comic series that's posted online called Ingress Adventuring Company. It's a comic about a wizard with anxiety who fights demons of his own making, I would say.
Sounds like my life.
So a lot of the work behind me are the raw inks that you can see on the website without any of the color that I implement later digitally.
Yeah, so I am a hobby or part-time artist. I do a lot of illustration as well as printmaking. For the past couple of years, since we haven't really had that many opportunities to go out and kind of show our work anywhere, I have mostly been assisting Kay with the production on Ingress. So after these pages get inked, before they get kind of the final colors, I will put the flats on the colors, as well as editing and helping with writing to some extent. But for my own work, I've kind of worked in a lot of different mediums and a lot of different stuff. I make a lot of kind of smaller things. In this gallery, you'll see some small zines that I made, some books, as well as some little pins, keychains, and some smaller things like little banners and prints as well.
Oh, cool. And you had mentioned earlier in an interview that you both somewhat collaborate on the story in your comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of times with the writing process, I will throw a lot of ideas at Jay and be like, hey, what about this? A good example is just like on the way up when we were driving, I was like, oh, what if this character has done something like really bad in their past, and we kind of riffed off of that and it was like, oh, we have to actually include this in the comic. So
yeah, I feel like in the writing process for the comic, I feel like I'm kind of an editor role, where like you said, Kay will like come up with ideas and then I'll help like brainstorm it, like, okay, so how will that like affect future chapters, like what, narrative choices do we have to make if that is true. And then of course also just like copy editing the scripts as we make them.
I think another example would be like this series. While I did the comic and I did all of the like writing and creating the work, the character is Jay's and the backstory information is like Jay's sort of like brainchild. I just wrote out the script and created this like visual narrative for it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and there's also like some future comics that we're kind of planning in the like scripting phase that is a more of a direct collaboration where like I'm actually like writing the script and then Kay is going back and like writing their part, so like kind of or like in tandem writing as well as
in tandem.
Yeah, in tandem.
Yeah.
What inspires your work and what are some of your influences?
I would say what inspires my work are probably just other people's stories, storytelling. I've played a lot of tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons, which is a major influence for this particular work. But a lot of when I was growing up, I read a lot of comics, a lot of Japanese comics that I managed to pick up from Barnes & Noble or Amazon when it was just starting out. And so I read a lot of those and I would just reread those. And I thought like, oh, I really want to tell stories like this. So I guess I'm doing that now.
Yeah, so I would say a lot of my influences are fantasy things, the occult. A lot of the stuff that you'll see here is kind of inspired by tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons. I think there's also a pretty big theme of like environmentalism in my work. The pieces that you'll see kind of hanging up are from a residency that had a pretty explicit like environmentalism theme, the work I produced there. So yeah, those are some of the main things.
And then Jay, with your work, are you guys not necessarily like influenced, but inspired, or any like inspirations? You'd spoken a little bit about that earlier, but maybe just as far as how, I don't know, are you creatively involved too with some of Jay's work?
Yeah, I feel like the stuff that I have on show here today, while like Kay doesn't have quite as much of a direct influence on it as like me, helping with the comic or whatever, but like there are things that Kay has definitely helped to introduce me to, like for example, all of the lino cut prints that I have. That's something I wouldn't have even really tried doing if Kay hadn't been like, hey, what if you tried out this? Because like I was always kind of intimidated by that kind of traditional printmaking.
And I was like, no, I've been doing this since I was 6.
Yeah, so you brought these skills to it that like really helped me feel comfortable trying new skills and stuff like that. And I would say also just like on a sort of a bigger level, both of us are obviously pretty influenced by like fantasy work. I think we have slightly different tastes there maybe, but that's a big influence on both of us.
Yeah,
well, like the occult and stuff.
We'll watch like Studio Ghibli movies.
Yeah, we watch a lot of animation.
So Studio Ghibli, that's the name of the
Yeah, they did
animation.
Spirited Away.
Oh, I don't know.
And
okay.
like My Neighbor Totoro and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So that's not really unknown, but it is animation and a little unusual.
Right.
Oh, cool. I'm gonna have to check those out. Do you guys? That's cool. You like the same things as far as, or I tend to gravitate towards watching unusual.
Yeah. I feel like part of it I think is just like when you're married to someone, like you end up watching TV together a lot, right?
Right.
But I do think we have quite a bit of overlap in terms of our taste.
Yeah.
Awesome. And the print that you just held up, what type of medium is that?
Yeah. So these that you'll see hanging are Riso prints. And Riso is kind of a unique printing technology that's somewhere in between a digital print and a traditional like printing press. So it's an electronic kind of early office style printer, that you'll see. But rather than just kind of being able to print things all in one pass the way you would with a printer now. You have to load up each color drum individually. And so you get these imperfections that are kind of reminiscent of like a silk screen that I think is really cool because it has this like really manual effect, even though it's kind of like this balance between electronic and traditional printing.
Cool. And then do you draw, like hand draw, and then put them through the printer? Or
so there's a few different ways you can do it. You can do that where you just like, basically you're making a photocopy, right?
Okay.
So what you have to do is you have to either draw it yourself out by hand and then make a photocopy in these different colors. Or what I did was I drew the images digitally, color separated them, which is how you get the kind of multiple colors, and then I printed them out digitally on like a regular office printer, and then I did the photocopies of it to, so those work as kind of like your lino cuts or your wood blocks or whatever, right? And then you photocopy it with different color drums that are aligned and, the images are aligned after you've separated them, and then that will kind of create your entire print.
Yeah, I would say like the thing about comics versus video or writing, it's like a really nice mesh between the two. It involves both writing and a visual sort of medium, and it requires a completely different set of skills from both, because you need to be able to tell action with a still image, which is not the easiest thing to do, but it's a lot of implied motion. And what I love to see is just the way you can get the feeling of an impact or the feeling of someone like moving really quickly with just a very still image, but it feels like it's not still at all as you read it and you're just like going through it. At the same time, there's the way that you can kind of get the same feeling you get from prose when you read sort of an internal monologue from someone of like, here's this long-winded thing about how I'm feeling in this particular moment, but you can get that with just a few images in a comic where you've got like a really dark panel and just a couple lines of their thoughts, and you're like, oh, this is really serious. So those are a couple of the things that are unique about comics that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I think that for me, I think actually for both of us, I think there's this combination of like analog and digital processes, right? And I think that maybe, I don't know if I'm gonna say I think it does inform the message because I think that there's like both this like vintage or like retro vibe to a lot of what we do. Like, you see like Kay doing all this kind of like brushwork, telling these stories that are kind of like these classic like fantasy stories or whatever. But then I think both of us also like put a very kind of like modern, twist on the work that we have.
Yeah. I mean, I think to extend that a little bit, we both see the importance in like environmentalism, and I don't know about you, but for me, I see a lot of importance in keeping some sort of traditions alive. And maybe
the craft.
Keeping the craft alive, which isn't necessarily like not necessarily being lost, but it is something that I really enjoy taking part in like these very analog ways of doing it, but like bringing it into a more modern look by having a digital sort of like touch afterwards for the printing process. But I really enjoy having a physical thing, because you never know when, like, say the internet might go away someday, which very unlikely, but 200 years down the line, you're not going to be able to find this website that I'm creating right now. But someone might. I would say for the creative process for comics, there's a couple different lines of processes that I go through personally. a lot of Western comics have very separate sort of tracks. There's a writer and an artist, and sometimes the artist is split into pencilers and inkers and colorists. What I'm doing is I'm doing all of those. So I have the writing part where I go through, I make a script, I bring it all out, I make the dialogue, I decide what the actions are going to be, and then I go through and I start to translate that into what a comic will be, which starts to look very, very rough, but it's starting to get this sort of like actions and ideas behind what I have in the script and the dialogue. After that, with those really, really rough sketches, I start bringing them onto the paper where I just, I do pencils, a couple rounds of like roughing everything out, figuring out how everything's going to look, doing any changes, and I work very analog until the inks are done. So after the pencils, I'll do the inks where I'll like put in all of these black fills and like any whiteout, fix any mistakes in the inks. Then I'll scan it in, add in some digital colors, since that works better online than just black and white, which has its pros and cons. It is sometimes easier to get the ideas across, but it means that it takes more time, and black and white comics aren't given the respect that they deserve sometimes. But I'll color those and then post them online. But I mean, the process that I do is really, really analog in comparison to some people who will just maybe do all digitally, or like one thing that I do that's fairly unusual today is I will still write out the text by hand, which is not super common anymore. That's very much a like a holdover from, I would say, newspaper comics. We're probably some of the last ones to do that, or some other like unusual odd ducks like me.
With these, I had, so it was done during a residency, so I had a week to finish the whole thing, which meant I had to kind of time out like how much time I had to draw the actual prints. And I knew I wanted to get like a series of prints done, right? So I was like, okay, so I can, if I get one of these illustrations done, you know, every day, then I'll have like this amount of time to actually do the printing process, because it is quite a manual printing process. It's a little bit of a finicky type of printmaking device to work with. So I knew that would also like take up a good amount of time in the residency. And I kind of like enjoyed doing that process where it's this combination between like the digital illustration, which is of course like something that is not manual in sort of the traditional artist sense, and then kind of switching over to this thing that involves a lot of like craft. I think that the craft elements of art is something that's really fun to explore. Like having a physical book versus reading something online can be a very different experience.
Despite putting all of my work on the internet for people to read, I much prefer to just read in a book, as much as the accessibility is there with online works, which I think is super important. I would much rather just like hold it in my hands. It just hurts my eyes to read all that.
I mean, it's like having that balance, right, between like accessibility of online and then like accessibility of printed work, right? Like I think those are both important to maintain in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. And you had just briefly mentioned something about when you're discussing these panels here, a brush. So this is, what types of materials you use? I was thinking maybe it was just pencil or pen, but...
Well, yeah, what you see here, none of that is currently pencil. I did pencil to sketch it out, but then I took a brush pen, which I buy these ones that you can refill, so I don't have to keep dipping my pen in, but I could dip my pen into ink. Okay. But I use a brush pen and just do all the lines with that, or like these blacks here, and then for that one in particular, those are ink washes for the grays.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I feel like there's this, I think both of us are really into that kind of like organic touch that you can get with traditional materials that it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to replicate that exact thing with digital. But there's also, so much more risk with traditional materials.
For me in particular, I think there's a benefit in that I have a fairly steady hand. So I can get really crisp lines, and I'm fairly accurate with my, like, the washes, but I also know how to make a mistake look like it was on purpose. So
that's a key to any art thing. Regardless of the medium.
It's a brave medium.
Yeah. Totally.
So you mentioned that you go to some comic, are they conventions? Do you also bring your work too, Jay? For some reason, I love the way that it meshes and speaks to each other up there.
Yeah. So we haven't really, for the past couple of years, haven't really gone to any. We're actually heading to the first one since 2019 in a couple of weeks, which is TCAF up in Toronto. And it'll just be Kay's work there because it's a really small space that we have. But we have, since we've been in a relationship, been exhibiting together pretty consistently at like comic shows. And there's a lot, so there's, when you kind of look at the like comic sphere in terms of shows and conventions, there's kind of a few different things, which is like, there's the anime conventions, which are huge, but neither of our art really fits into that category. And then there's comic conventions, which are a little bit more geared toward like specifically like picking up books, people selling kind of their actual like sequential art, right? And then there's also like zine fests or like indie art fairs, right? And that I think is probably the best fit for like both of us together.
Especially since the comic sphere of the comic conventions, it'll be hit and miss whether it is more indie comics or if it's like
a bunch of Marvel and DC artists.
Marvel and DC.
That are selling their stuff. Which like weirdly indie comics and superhero comics
don't have a big overlap.
Very not overlapping audience.
If someone's into Marvel and DC, they're into like superheroes.
Right.
Which is it's a huge genre in itself, but does not have a lot of overlap with what we're making at all.
It's unique.
One thing I try to leave some things open to interpretation, like with any form of art, like writing especially, or like movies and film. There's that sort of like open interpretation of like what could this stand for, despite it having like obvious words and people are communicating like specific ideas out. You still have everyone coming away with a different sort of idea of what the story is or what it might represent or the themes of it. So I try to keep things a little bit open with that and not try and say this is the exact meaning or this is exactly what I want you to pull away. But sometimes there's just things that I definitely don't want people to be interpreting. Like if they think that I have some specific opinion, I'd rather be this weird absent presence in the work rather than like it being all about my sort of like opinions about the world. I don't necessarily want that. I want to tell a story.
Where does it go from here then? What formats can people enjoy?
Currently I am working on the first two chapters, which I do have a couple here at the studio. I have printed out previously in just individual chapters, but I'm trying to compile a book at the moment, and so I'm going back and recoloring those first two chapters so it all matches. And so eventually I would like to self-publish that or maybe pitch it to a publisher and get it printed. So that's the long goal for that. Otherwise, it can be read online at ingresscomic.com.
And how do you know when your work is done?
Right.
Like, do you get a feeling, or I don't know? That's such a tough question.
Yeah, totally. I think that in general, I have like an image in my head when I'm kind of starting out and working at, I feel like I kind of chip away at the piece in one way or another until it kind of starts to match what the image in my head looks like. And then, of course, you know, it's never exactly how you want it to be, right? but like the ways that I work with illustration and printmaking, I feel like there is, it's this kind of iterative process, right? Where you kind of like do it and like go back and then like look at it as a whole and you're like, it's not quite ready yet. And then you kind of work at it a little bit more. There's not like a specific, but then like when you want to take something to like the print, like the final production, you have to like, there's this point where you have to make a choice that, okay, the drawing is done, right? Like this part is done, and you just have to be satisfied with where it is.
You just commit to it.
Yep, and then you have to, commit to the final work.
If you had a superpower, what would it be, or what is your superpower?
My superpower is being able to put in a USB in the right way 90% of the time.
That is an incredible superpower that I am very envious of, and I'm sure the whole world is. If you had a superpower, what would it be, or what is your superpower? And it's such a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah. If I had a superpower, it would be making perfect, over easy fried eggs every single time.
Oh, that is awesome. And when you acquire that, we're all coming down for breakfast.
Yeah, I'll make lunch for everybody.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for letting us interview you. Thank you so much for showing. We're super excited that you're kicking off our In-Tandem series. So please tell our viewers where people can find you, online, offline, where they can find your work, buy your comics, buy your work.
Now, if you want to read the comic, you can read it at ingresscomic.com. You can also find more of my work on my social media, or if you want to support my work, you can find me on Patreon under Kayartix, so Kayartics.
So you can find my work, including a few games that you can buy PDFs of, at jayrossart.com, JAYROSSART.com. And we will also be at a couple of upcoming art shows selling mostly Ingress things. We'll be at TCAF in Toronto in a couple of weeks, as well as Convergence in Minneapolis in August.
Oh, terrific. Thank you so much again. And Kay and Jay's work will be up through June 26th. Their reception is upcoming this Saturday, 4 to 7. So thanks so much again, you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.